At 7:40 on a wet Thursday morning, Wade Holloway fired a patient transport aide for being slow. By 2 o'clock that same afternoon, he was sitting in a lawyer's office, hearing the woman's name read aloud from his dead father's will, next to $250,000, a cabin on Pinehurst Lake, and 6 words his father had set aside for no one but him. The aide he had erased on his way to a budget meeting turned out to be the last person his father had trusted. And the 6 words she would never read were not written for Odessa Pruitt. They were written for Wade. Wade Holloway's alarm went off at 4:50 every morning, and every morning he was already lying there with his eyes open, waiting for it. He didn't believe in lingering in bed. Lingering meant the mind started to wander, and a wandering mind landed on things that had nothing to do with occupancy rates or labor costs, and he had trained himself out of those places a long time ago. His condo sat on the 11th floor of a renovated mill downtown, exposed brick and tall windows, and from his kitchen he could see the river moving slow and brown under the bridges. He liked it best at that hour, when the city was still mostly machinery and no people had complicated it yet. He showered in 6 minutes, put on one of the dark gray suits that hung in a row like a printed pattern, and was out the door by 5:35. No breakfast at home. Coffee belonged to the office, where it did a job. By 6, he was at his desk on the top floor of Holloway Regional, the hospital network his father, Silas Holloway, had started in a single storefront clinic 40 years back and grown into 9 facilities across 3 counties. Wade had been running it as CEO for 5 years now, ever since his father's heart first started failing in earnest, and in those 5 years he had cut the cost per discharge by 19%. He was proud of that number. Numbers didn't get sentimental on you. Numbers didn't change their story when you weren't looking. That morning he pulled up the staffing dashboard, the one his analytics team refreshed every night while the building slept. Rows of names, columns of metrics, average task time, call light response, unscheduled absences, written complaints. He didn't see faces in that grid. He saw friction and throughput, and when a line ran red long enough, the line came out. He flagged 4 of them. Third from the bottom was Odessa Pruitt, patient transport, day shift. Average transport time 11 minutes over the floor target, 2 unscheduled absences in the month. And, that week, a single incident note. A patient on the cardiac floor had reported a missing wristwatch, and a unit manager named Brett Lanahan had written in the margin that Pruitt had been the last staffer in the room. On the corner of Wade's desk sat a brass pocket compass, old and tarnished, the glass scratched milky in one spot. It had been his father's. Wade kept it there because it had a nice weight to it and held down the loose pages of a contract on a windy day when the window was open. That was what he told himself. He never opened it. He didn't know if the needle still swung true. 3 floors down, Odessa Pruitt was already pushing an empty wheelchair toward the elevator bank at 6:40, 20 minutes before her shift technically began. She always came early. Not because anyone asked. She came early because the families who'd slept upright in waiting room chairs all night looked at you differently when you arrived calm and unhurried, and because the patients who hadn't slept either could hear it in your footsteps if you were rushing. So she got there before the rush could catch her, and she moved at the speed a frightened person needed her to move, which was almost never the speed the clock wanted. She had been a nurse once, a licensed practical nurse, 14 years, good at it, the kind who could find a vein nobody else could, and talk a scared kid into holding still. Then there had been a medication error on a night when the floor was 3 people short, and a doctor's order had been written in handwriting nobody could read. And when administration went looking for a name to put on the incident, hers had been the one nobody important would miss. She'd signed what they put in front of her because the young nurse who'd actually transcribed the order had 2 babies at home and a husband already gone. And somebody was going to lose a license that week regardless. Odessa had decided it would be her. She lost the credential. She kept her dignity, which nobody could take, only borrow without asking. She was 63 now. The transport job paid less than half of what nursing had, and her knees told her about it every flight of stairs. But 3 evenings a week after her granddaughter was fed and the dishes were done, she sat at the kitchen table, under a lamp, with 2 missing prongs on its plug, and studied for the exam that would give her license back. She'd already passed one of the 3 sections. She hadn't told a soul at the hospital. It wasn't anybody's business yet, and she'd learned a long time ago that people guarded their good news until it was solid, because the world had a way of stepping on it while it was still soft. That Thursday she'd come up the elevator, with a man named Mr. Renfro, 86, going down for an echocardiogram. Terrified of the machine because the last time he was in one, his wife had been alive and waiting in the hall. Odessa knew that because she asked. She always asked. She got him talking about his wife's roses, and by the time the tech came out, he was halfway through a story and had forgotten to be afraid. It had taken 9 extra minutes. On the dashboard upstairs, those 9 minutes were a red number. When she wheeled an empty chair back past the 4th-floor nurse's station, a young resident in fresh scrubs stepped out of a patient room reading something on his phone and walked straight into the path she'd just mopped a wet wheel across. He skidded, caught the counter, and looked down at his shoe, then up at her with the expression people save for a vending machine that ate their dollar. She started to say careful, the floor's slick there, and he was already gone, scrubbing his soul against the carpet runner, not a word. She didn't expect a thank you. She'd stopped expecting those somewhere around her 40th birthday. What she expected was the quiet, the way people's eyes slid off her in the cafeteria line, the way doctors discussed a patient's chart over her head as if she were the wall. She was used to it. Used to a thing isn't the same as not feeling it. Wade Holloway was not having a decent morning, and he hadn't had one in 11 days, not since his father died. Silas had passed on a Sunday afternoon in a private room on the very cardiac floor of the very hospital his name was bolted to over the front entrance. He'd been a patient there off and on for 2 years, in and out as his heart gave more ground each season. At the end, a hospice nurse had been with him, and Wade had been in a strategy session about the Q3 merger when his phone lit up. He'd let it go to voicemail and listened to it in the parking garage 40 minutes later. He'd handled the arrangements after that the way he handled everything. Venue, obituary, the right people notified in the right order. He had not cried. He'd told himself there'd be time for that, the way he told himself there'd be time for a lot of things, and the time kept not arriving. At 7:30, Wendell Pace, the head of people operations, knocked on Wade's open door with a tablet under his arm. Wendell was a careful man in his 50s who believed that process existed because somebody had once been burned without it. He laid out the 4 flagged names. When he reached Odessa Pruitt, he stopped and chose his words. The watch incident, he said, was unconfirmed. Security was still pulling footage, and the patient had a documented history of misplacing things. Pruitt's patient satisfaction scores, he added, were the highest in the entire transport pool, by a margin that wasn't close. Standard procedure was a written notice and a chance to respond. She'd had no discipline in 3 years. Wade didn't look up from his screen. "I'm not paying for slow," he said, "and I'm not paying for a theft question hanging over a floor. Let her go today." Wendell shifted his weight. "There's no finding of theft if we terminate before the footage clears her, and it does clear her. Then we'll have made a clean decision based on the numbers I had this morning." Wade finally lifted his eyes. "Process her out, Wendell." Wendell held his gaze a beat longer than he needed to. Then he tapped the tablet dark and left without another word. He'd worked with Wade long enough to know the door had already closed. What happened next wasn't in any plan. Wade stepped out of his office 20 minutes later to walk down to the imaging suite, where the new contractor was running behind, and as the elevator doors opened on the third floor, there she was. A heavy-set woman in maroon transport scrubs, a name badge that said Prout T, parking an empty chair against the wall. Later, Wade would not be able to explain why he did it right there, in the open hallway, with two nurses and a family of three standing close enough to hear. Maybe it was the merger memo still burning a hole in his inbox. Maybe it was that he'd buried his father 11 days ago and the only thing that still answered to him was the org chart. Maybe it was just that her name was sitting red on a list in his head, and the gap between deciding and doing had narrowed to nothing. He told her, evenly, the way he delivered every directive, that her position had been eliminated and her badge was deactivated effective immediately. He said it the way you'd read a flight cancellation. Odessa held the handles of the empty chair. She looked at him for a moment. Not angry, not pleading, something closer to recognition, as if she had been waiting a long time for a man in a suit to say exactly this and was only now meeting him. She asked one thing. "Can I take Mr. Renfro back up to 4 first? He's waiting on me. He gets turned around if a stranger comes." Wade said nothing. Odessa nodded once, like the answer settled something she'd suspected. She rolled the chair neatly into the alcove where it belonged, reached up and unclipped her badge, and set it on the counter at the nurse's station with a small click. She didn't look back. Her shoes, white sneakers, gone gray and soft at the toes, made almost no sound at all as she crossed the lobby and pushed out through the sliding doors into the rain. The hallway stayed quiet after she left. One of the nurses turned back to her monitor. The father and the family of 3 watched the doors a second too long. Down by the elevators, Wendell Payas stood with his tablet against his chest and shook his head just barely and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that Wade would hear. Wade went back up to his office and shut the door. For a second, his eyes caught on the brass compass, holding down the contract pages. His hand twitched toward it, then he pulled his laptop closer instead and opened the merger file. Control. Always control. At 1 o'clock, he drove across town to the offices of Cruz and Associates. His father's attorney, Adelaide Cruz, was a small, composed woman in her late 60s who'd handled Silas's affairs for 2 decades and been his friend for longer. The conference room smelled of paper and lemon polish, and the radiator ticked. Wade sat at the long table alone. He was Silas's only child. There was no one else who needed a chair. Adelaide opened the folder, put on her glasses, and began. The first items were exactly what Wade expected. The Riverview condo to be sold, proceeds to a children's hospital downtown, Silas's books to the county library. A generous, sensible sum to Wade himself and the controlling shares of Holloway Regional, which Wade already ran. He listened with half his attention, already composing the afternoon's emails in his head. Then Adelaide turned a page and read the next line slowly. "The way you read something you know will change the temperature of a room. I leave the sum of $250,000 and my cabin at Pinehurst Lake to Odessa Pruitt, who gave the last 2 years of my life the dignity my own company had forgotten how to offer." Wade's hand flattened on the table. "I'm sorry. What name?" Adelaide looked at him over the rims of her glasses. "Odessa Pruitt." The name went through him like cold water down the back of the neck. He knew that name. He had said that name's surname out loud 4 hours ago to a woman holding the handles of an empty wheelchair. The image arrived without permission, the maroon scrubs, the badge clicking onto the counter, the gray sneakers crossing the lobby. His mouth opened. "That's a transport aide. At my hospital. He stopped. "I let her go this morning." Adelaide took off her glasses and folded her hands. Her expression didn't move. "Your father spoke of her often. With a great deal of respect." Wade stared at the page. The ink didn't rearrange itself. And underneath the shock, something else was already starting. A question he wasn't ready to ask but couldn't put down. Why would Silas Holloway, who built 9 hospitals from a storefront, leave $250,000 and the cabin where he'd taught his son to fish to a woman who pushed wheelchairs. And what did the dignity my own company had forgotten how to offer mean, except as a knife aimed at the one running the company? He didn't go back to the office. He drove for an hour with no destination, out past the strip malls and the new subdivisions with their bald front yards, then back along the river before he parked in the garage under his building and sat in the dark with the engine off. The one line wouldn't leave him alone. The dignity my own company had forgotten how to offer. He turned it over like a stone, feeling for the crack that would let him drop it. By the time he rode the elevator up, he thought he'd found one. His father had gone soft at the end. Everybody did. A sick old man, 2 years in and out of hospital beds, lonely, grateful to whatever face was kind to him. Of course, he'd overweighted some aide who chatted with him. Sentiment. It clouded judgment. Wade had spent his whole life filing it under liability. That evening, he called Adelaide back. His voice was steady, the board meeting voice he used when a number didn't reconcile. "I need to ask you something straight, Adelaide. In the last couple of years, was he sharp? Any decline you noticed? Any chance somebody close to him steered this?" Adelaide's answer came without a pause. "He drafted this 13 months before he passed. I sat across from him for every session. His mind was clear as a bell, Wade. I tested that myself more than once, because I knew you'd ask me this exact question. He knew you would, too." Wade pressed the phone harder against his ear. "Then why would he give $250,000 to a woman who moves wheelchairs?" The line was quiet. Then Adelaide said, gently but without softening it, "That's a question only your father can answer." And he did try, Wade. There's a letter. He left it where he knew you'd find it if you ever went looking. He wasn't sure you would. He hung up without saying goodbye, set the phone on the counter, and stood looking at the dark river. Somewhere out there, a woman he'd erased that morning was eating dinner, not knowing yet that she was the center of his father's last wishes. He couldn't get the two pictures to lie down together, the aide in the hallway and the name in the will. In his head, they didn't belong to the same person, because the world he'd built didn't allow that kind of overlap. That was the whole of it. Not hatred, not cruelty, just an imagination that had never once stretched far enough to picture her as a full human being. He decided he'd look into it. Not to honor the will, to prove the old man wrong. He was at the office before 6 the next morning. He went straight to Wendell Pace's desk and asked for Odessa Pruitt's complete file. Wendell looked at him a long second before he unlocked the cabinet. He said nothing about the timing, that Wade had fired her yesterday and was reading her record today. But his face said plenty. The file was thin. Odessa Pruitt, 63, hired 4 years ago, day shift transport, prior employment. 14 years as a licensed practical nurse, 3 different hospitals, ending with a license revocation. Wade skimmed past and then, against his own intention, went back and read in full. A medication incident. A signature. He noticed, the way a man trained on numbers notices, that the dosage discrepancy didn't match the drug she'd supposedly logged. The math was off in a way that suggested a transcription error upstream of whoever signed for it. He set that aside. Under a section marked Continuing Education, in small, careful handwriting that had to be her own, added when she'd updated her file the previous fall. Studying for LPN re-licensure, NCLEX PN, one of 3 sections passed. He read it twice. It didn't fit the story he'd built, a woman who'd settled, who lacked drive, who was exactly where she belonged. This was someone clawing her way back towards something, 3 nights a week, asking no one to clap for it. Wendell was still standing by the cabinet. He cleared his throat. "For what it's worth," he said, "the security footage came back last night. Pruitt never touched the watch. Renfro had set it inside a tissue box on his tray. Housekeeping found it at the morning empty." He paused. "She's also the only transport aide in 5 years with 0 patient complaints. We've got thank you notes in there. One family wrote a whole letter, asked us to make sure we knew what we had. Wade closed the file. Something behind his sternum had moved a quarter inch and wouldn't move back. The file told him she was a person. It didn't tell him how his father had ever met her. For that, he had to go somewhere he'd been avoiding. He drove out to his father's house that afternoon, a brick ranch on a tree-lined street where Silas had stayed long after he could have bought anything in the city. Wade had grown up there. He'd learned to ride a bike on that sidewalk, done his homework at that kitchen table, walked out the front door at 18 with a duffel bag, and a certainty he'd never need to look back, and he'd been mostly right about that. The house smelled the same: coffee and old paper and a faint cedar tang from the workshop out back. A coffee mug still sat in the drying rack, washed and never put away. He went into the study. The shelves were full: history, biographies of men who built things, a worn Bible his father read for the stories more than the sermons. On the desk, a green-shaded lamp with a chip in the glass. On the wall, the framed photographs of Silas's public life: the ribbon cutting at the first clinic, a handshake with a governor, a charity gala in a tuxedo that never sat right on his shoulders. And then, on the shelf by the window, one more photo Wade had never seen. Silas, in a flannel shirt, standing on the cabin dock at Pinehurst, laughing, not the closed-mouth photo smile, a real one, head tipped back. Beside him, holding the other end of a stringer of fish, stood a sturdy gray-haired woman in a sun hat, laughing just as hard. It was Odessa Pruitt. Wade picked up the frame. His hands weren't quite steady. It was the only picture on that shelf where his father looked happy instead of important. A knock came at the front door. A woman stood on the porch, mid-70s, small and square, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a casserole dish in her hands she clearly hadn't planned to bring but had grabbed when she saw a car. She introduced herself as Mavis Dunmore, 2 doors down, and she stepped inside without quite waiting to be asked. "I knew your daddy 31 years, she said. "He shoveled my walk every winter until that heart of his wouldn't let him, and then he hired the neighbor boy to do it and never told me, so I wouldn't fuss." She set the dish on the counter and looked at Wade with eyes that had earned the right to say hard things. When Wade asked carefully about Odessa Pruitt, Mavis's whole face changed. "Odessa. Lord, yes. Your daddy met her in that hospital of yours. You know that? First bad spell. 2 winters back. She was the one wheeling him down to all those tests. Most of those folks just push you and stare at their phone," he said. "She'd sit with him in the hall till they called him back, and she'd be there waiting when he came out, and she remembered every blessed thing about him. How he took his coffee, his late wife's name, that he didn't like the radio in the waiting room. He told me, 'Mavis, that woman makes a 6-old man feel like a man instead of a chart.'" Mavis pulled out a kitchen chair and sat without asking. After he got out, he tracked her down, found out she lived near the bus line out by the Tannery Road, started having her out to the lake on her days off. She'd fish, he'd cook, they'd argue about cards. She fixed that screen door he could never get right. Mavis's voice dropped. "Your daddy was lonesome, honey. After your mama passed and you got busy. Odessa didn't take anybody's place, nobody could, but she was there. And at the end, when a person's mostly waiting, being there is just about the whole job." Wade said nothing. He waited until Mavis had gone before he sat back down at the desk. He found the journal in the top drawer, a leather notebook filled with his father's slanting hand, the kind of writing they'd stopped teaching. He turned to the last year of entries and read. One from a spring afternoon. Odessa came out to the cabin. Patched the dock plank I've been meaning to get to since March. Wouldn't let me pay. Said I'd taught her how the depth finder works and that squared us. This is the kind of person I keep hoping Wade will learn to see. Another from the fall, longer. Odessa told me something today that I can't shake. One of the doctors at the hospital chewed her out in front of patients for taking too long with an old fella who was scared. Took too long. She wasn't angry telling it. She just said, "Mr. Silas, scared takes the time it takes." I laughed. Then I lay awake half the night thinking about my own building, wondering if I built a place that punishes a woman for the exact thing that makes her good at it, wondering if my son measures the wrong minutes. Wade's throat tightened. He turned the page. The next entry stopped him cold, dated 4 months before Silas died. I want to call Wade and tell him there's a woman in his hospital worth 10 of his department heads. But I know, my boy. He'd say, "Dad, you're handing out the lake cabin to a wheelchair pusher." And the way he'd land on those last words would tell me everything I already fear about who he's become. So I'll write it down instead and let the lawyer say it after I'm gone, when he can't argue me out of it. Wade closed the journal and pressed his palm flat on the cover, as if he could hold the words inside it. But they were already loose in him. He understood now. His father hadn't gotten her the job. She'd already worked there. They'd met as patient and aide, two strangers in a hallway, and his father, who could buy a wing of that hospital, had been treated like a person by a woman the building paid the least, and it had meant more to him than any of it. And Silas had said nothing to his son because saying it would only confirm the thing he was most afraid of, that Wade would hear wheelchair pusher and stop listening. In the bottom of the desk there was a narrow false drawer behind the main one, a hidden space Wade had discovered as a kid and forgotten for 30 years. He pulled the front drawer all the way out and reached back, and his fingers found an envelope. On the front, in his father's hand. For Wade. When you go looking, he opened it standing up. The letter was dated 9 months before Silas died. Silas wrote that he knew Wade would fight the will. He knew Wade would look for the soft spot, the dementia, the manipulation, the angle, because that was how Wade had learned to keep the world from touching him. And Silas loved him anyway, even grieved for what that strength had cost the boy. He wrote about Odessa. She doesn't need my money to be a good woman. She was good long before a sick old man crossed her path. But the world keeps charging her for things that aren't her fault, and keeps refusing her the chance to climb back, and I have the means to put my thumb on that scale, and I'd be a coward not to. Then, the letter turned toward Wade, and the words landed like stones in still water. I know you'll meet her. You may have already met her and not known it, because you look at people the way you read a spreadsheet. You see a position and a cost, not a soul. I built that hospital to take care of people, and I am afraid I handed it to a man who learned to take care of margins. That's my failure as much as yours. I was so proud of you for being strong that I forgot to teach you to be kind. And then, alone at the bottom of the page, with a wide space above it like a held breath. If you're reading this and you feel angry, then I was right. If you're reading this and it hurts, then there's still time. You were never the bottom line. 6 words on the last line set apart. The 6 words Adelaide had read around, without reading. The 6 words that were not in the will and were not for Odessa. Wade set the letter on the desk. He looked out the window at the workshop, dark in the late light, where his father and a transport aide had once stood laughing with a string of fish. He didn't cry, not then. He sat in his father's chair, in the room that still smelled like the man, and felt for the first time in his adult life that the ground under the person he thought he was had quietly gone out from under him. The brass compass on his office desk 12 miles away stopped being a paperweight in his mind and became something else. His father, still trying to point him somewhere, still waiting for the needle to catch. 2 days passed. Wade didn't go in. Wendell called, the merger team called, a board member called twice. He let it all roll to voicemail. He sat in his condo with the letter on the coffee table and read it again each morning, and each time a different line cut deeper, until the last morning all that was left was the 6 words. You were never the bottom line. He understood finally that his father hadn't written them to wound him. He'd written them the way a man calls a name into the dark, hoping. On the 3rd morning, Wade stood in front of his bathroom mirror and didn't recognize the man in it, unshaven, gray under the eyes, the careful armor gone. He asked himself a question he'd never put to a board or a balance sheet. What would his father say if he could see him right now? And the answer came at once. Silas wouldn't say anything. He'd just look at him the way he always had near the end. Patient, sad, reaching for a son he couldn't quite touch. Wade picked up his keys. The address in the file led him out past the rail yards, to a block of low brick apartments with iron stairs and bare trees, clean and worn, the kind of place people kept tidy because they couldn't afford to let it slide. He climbed the outside stairway in his good shoes and stood at a door with a faded welcome mat, scrubbed nearly blank. He knocked. Odessa opened it. She wore a cardigan and house slippers, and she looked at him the way you look at weather you'd already seen coming. "I wondered if you'd turn up," she said. There was no surprise in it. "Mr. Silas told me you might." Wade's mouth opened and nothing came. He'd walked in with no plan, no script, for the first time in his working life. She stepped back and held the door. "Come on in, before you let the cold in." The apartment was small and exact. Tools hung on a pegboard over a little workbench, each one traced in marker so it could find its place. A handmade bookshelf stood against the wall. The joints fitted clean, and Wade knew the style before he could stop himself because he'd watched his father make that same dovetail 100 times. On the kitchen table, nursing review books, a spiral notebook in tight handwriting, a printout of an exam date circled in red, 8 weeks out. He sat in the chair she offered, a plain, sturdy thing he'd have bet his father made, and he gripped the seat and looked at her. "I came to say I'm sorry," he said, and the words came out raw, with none of the finish he usually put on things. "Not just for firing you, for not knowing your name. 4 years you worked in my building and you were a number on a list to me. The watch, the footage cleared you. It was never you. I should never have let it be a question." Odessa folded her hands on the table. She didn't rush to fill the quiet. "You're not the first man who couldn't see me," she said at last, no heat in it and no warmth either. "I made my peace with that years ago." She looked at him steady. "But your daddy saw me the first morning he ever rode my elevator, asked my name and used it. You'd be amazed how rare that is." Wade asked the thing that had been circling him since the journal. "Why didn't you ever say you knew him? You could have used it. You could have said it the second I let you go." Her head tipped, like the question puzzled her. "Because I didn't want to keep a job on account of who I knew. I wanted it on account of how I worked." She let a beat go by, and that turned out not to be enough either. Did it? He couldn't answer. "I'm not angry at you, Mr. Holloway," she said, quieter now, heavier, like she was setting down something she'd carried a long way. "I'm tired. Tired of proving I'm a whole person while folks who walk in the front door get that handed to them for free." The room was still after that, not the silence of strangers, but the weight of two people who'd come at the same truth from opposite ends. After a while, Wade made himself speak. He offered her a job back, not transport. Director of Patient Experience, a real title, real pay, a hand getting her license restored. The hospital's lawyers against the old revocation he was now fairly sure had been somebody else's error pinned to her chest. Odessa shook her head, not in anger. With the calm of a woman who'd decided long before he knocked. "I sit for my boards in 8 weeks, she said. "Your daddy gave me more than money, you understand. He gave me back the idea that I'm owed a chance. But I have to be the one who takes it. Not be handed it by the boss who fired me, so he can sleep better." She stood and went to the counter and came back with a small wooden box, hinged lid, edges sanded so fine they caught the light. "He made this for you," she said, "out at the cabin. Finished it a month before he passed. Meant to mail it and never got the time." Wade thought she might have smiled, just barely. He always meant to get to things. Wade opened the lid. On a square of dark felt lay a photograph, Silas, young and lean with a full head of dark hair, a small boy riding his shoulders, both of them squinting into sun off the lake. The boy's hands were locked in his father's hair, and his mouth was wide open mid-law, the kind of laugh that only exists before the world teaches you to keep score of it. Wade turned it over. On the back in his father's hand, faded but plain. "My boy, the needle still works. You just have to open it." Wade pressed the photograph to his chest with both hands and could not speak. His father had known he would come to this apartment. He'd told Odessa so. "She's not a hard woman, my Wade," he'd said to her once. "On the dock, she's just somebody who got lost so far back she forgot she was looking." Sometimes a lost person sees somebody to stand still long enough for them to find the way. Odessa had stood still, and Wade had found it. He went back to Holloway Regional the next morning. The receptionist startled. Two managers in the hall stopped mid-sentence. He walked past them to his office and called Wendell Pace in. "Starting today," Wade said, "every termination crosses your desk first, mine included, no exceptions." Wendell studied his face a moment, didn't smile, didn't congratulate him, just nodded once and picked up his tablet and left, because he knew Wade well enough to know it wasn't a performance. It was a correction, and corrections don't ask for or applause. Over the weeks that followed, he made changes, no speeches, just the small, deliberate adjustments of a man learning to see what he'd spent years stepping over. Mandatory review before any dismissal. A hardship fund for staff in a bad month, not charity, a bridge. He started reading the patient satisfaction notes himself, the ones from families, the ones that named the transport aides and the housekeepers and the cafeteria woman who'd sat with somebody's mother. He learned the names of the people who pushed the chairs and emptied the trash in the building that had his family's name over the door. He was still Wade, still sharp, still demanding, still the man who wanted the numbers right, but he had finally understood the thing his father had been trying to hand him. That efficiency without humanity isn't leadership, it's just machinery, and machines don't build anything worth leaving to your kid. 7 months later, he was driving back from a site review out past the Tannery Road when he passed a small storefront he didn't remember being there before. A fresh sign hung over the door, white letters on deep green. "Prute Home Care, Licensee." He slowed and pulled to the curb. Through the glass, he could see her in a button-down shirt instead of maroon scrubs, leaning over a desk with a clipboard, talking a young aide through a schedule on a whiteboard. A filing cabinet. 2 desks, small, hers. She looked up and saw him through the window. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she nodded once. Not the nod of someone walking away from something, the nod of someone who'd arrived. Wade nodded back. Then he put the car in drive and pulled away, and he let her keep the morning that belonged to her. Silas Holloway didn't leave that woman $250,000 out of pity. He left it out of respect. The kind you don't earn with titles or quarterly numbers, but with the way you treat a frightened stranger in a hallway when there's no profit in it and nobody important is watching. And the 6 words he saved for his son weren't a punishment. They were a hand held out across a distance he was afraid his boy would never cross. So here's the thing worth sitting with. Before you go, the real measure of a person was never printed on a badge or bolted over a door. It's in how you treat the people you've quietly decided can do nothing for you. The ones you walk past, the ones whose names you never bothered to learn. And if this story made you think, even for 1 second, of somebody you've looked straight through, then maybe that letter wasn't only written for Wade. Maybe, in some small way, it was meant for all of us.